April 20th, 1936, Berlin, Germany. The spring morning broke cold over the Reich Chancellery as Adolf Hitler stood before a mirror, adjusting his uniform. Today marked his 47th birthday, and he had prepared a gift for himself, one that would echo through history with the weight of steel and blood. He would resurrect an honor dormant since the Great War, the rank of General Field Marshal of the German Armed Forces. The decision was calculated, theatrical, and fundamentally political. In the old Prussian tradition, Field Marshals represented the pinnacle of military achievement. Warriors who had proven themselves in the crucible of battle, strategists whose names inspired fear in enemies and reverence among their own troops. But Hitler understood something his Prussian predecessors had not. Rank was not merely about military competence. It was about loyalty, propaganda, and control. Werner von Blomberg became the first to receive the Marshal's baton that day, his chest swelling with pride as Hitler clasped his shoulder. But Blomberg could not have known that this honor came with invisible chains, that accepting Hitler's favor meant binding one's fate to a madman's vision of conquest and racial destiny. Over the next 9 years, Hitler would elevate 23 more men to this supposedly sacred rank. Some earned it through genuine military brilliance. Men like Erwin Rommel, whose tactical innovations in North Africa earned him legendary status even among his enemies. Others received it as political theater after victories that had more to do with numerical superiority and blitzkrieg momentum than strategic genius. And still others were promoted in desperation, Hitler's way of demanding loyalty through flattery when defeat loomed on every horizon. The Field Marshals commanded armies that swept across Poland in weeks, that brought France to its knees in 40 days, that stood at the gates of Moscow and drove deep into the Soviet heartland. They orchestrated campaigns across deserts and mountains, through the frozen steppes of Russia and the ancient cities of Europe. At their peak, these 24 men controlled the destinies of millions. Soldiers who marched to their orders, civilians who lived or died by their decisions, entire nations that trembled at the mention of their names. But the rank of Field Marshal in Hitler's Reich carried a curse that none of them fully understood when they accepted their batons. Unlike their predecessors in Imperial Germany, they served not a Kaiser bound by military tradition and aristocratic codes of honor, but a revolutionary dictator who viewed them as tools to be used and discarded. Hitler had no respect for the old officer corps, no reverence for their Prussian traditions or their notions of military honor. He saw them as necessary instruments of conquest, brilliant when they won, expendable when they failed, dangerous when they questioned. The Field Marshals believed their rank placed them above the chaos, that their positions insulated them from the regime's brutality. They told themselves they were soldiers, not politicians, that they could serve Germany without serving Hitler's ideology. This delusion would prove fatal for many of them. As Germany's fortunes turned, as the tide of war shifted from lightning victories to grinding defeats, the Field Marshals found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. They had tied their names to Hitler's regime, accepted honors from his hands, implemented orders that blurred the line between military necessity and war crimes. And as the Reich collapsed around them, they would discover that there was no safe harbor, no honorable retirement waiting at the end of service. Some would die in the chaos of battle, caught in the maelstrom they had helped create. Others would face execution, not by enemy tribunals, but by Hitler himself, the man who had elevated them to glory, now demanding their deaths as payment for failure or suspected disloyalty. Many would choose suicide over the humiliation of surrender or trial, swallowing poison or placing pistols to their temples in desperate final acts of control. Those who survived to face Allied justice would stand in the dock at Nuremberg, their medals and honors stripped away, their military achievements overshadowed by their complicity in atrocity. The story of how these 24 men died is not merely a catalog of individual fates. It is the story of how absolute power corrupts, how military excellence without moral foundation leads to ruin, how men who thought themselves above history were consumed by it. Their deaths, whether violent, degrading, or mercifully natural, reflect the trajectory of Nazi Germany itself, a rocket's rise followed by an inevitable, catastrophic fall. This is not the history of how they fought, though fight they did with skill and determination. This is the chronicle of how they fell. The Field Marshals who commanded continents and died in disgrace, who wore their rank like armor, but found it offered no protection against the judgment of history or the consequences of their choices. 24 men, 24 batons, 24 different paths routes to the same destination: ruin, defeat, and an end that matched the brutality of the regime they served. The briefing room at the Wolf's Lair was thick with cigarette smoke and tension when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed his briefcase under the conference table, just 6 feet from where Adolf Hitler bent over military maps. Inside the leather case, a bomb ticked toward detonation, a last, desperate attempt by German officers to kill the Führer and salvage what remained of Germany's honor and future. The explosion tore through the room at 12:42 p.m., killing 4 men and wounding most of the others. But Hitler survived, protected by the thick oak table that deflected the blast. His hair singed, his right arm injured, his eardrums damaged. He emerged from the wreckage like a demon reborn, more convinced than ever of his destiny and more determined to purge the Wehrmacht of anyone who might question his absolute authority. The reprisals came swift and merciless. Among those swept up in the dragnet was Erwin von Witzleben, a 63-year-old field marshal who had once commanded armies on the Western Front, but had been forced into retirement after criticizing Hitler's military strategies. Witzleben had agreed to serve as commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht if the coup succeeded. Now he would pay for that agreement with his life, but not before Hitler extracted maximum humiliation. The People's Court, presided over by the screaming red-faced Judge Roland Freisler, was less a tribunal than a theater of degradation. Witzleben was denied a belt, his pants falling down repeatedly as he stood before the court. Freisler interrupted his every attempt to speak, shouting him down, mocking him, reducing a decorated field marshal to a helpless old man struggling to keep his trousers up. The verdict was never in doubt. On August 8, 1944, Witzleben was taken to Plötzensee prison in Berlin. The execution method had been carefully chosen by Hitler himself, hanging by piano wire from meat hooks, a slow strangulation designed to maximize suffering. Cameras recorded everything for Hitler's personal viewing. Witzleben died slowly, his body twitching for minutes before death finally came. 8 field marshals witnessed his humiliation in court. None spoke in his defense. But Witzleben was not the only field marshal whose death came directly from Hitler's orders, or Hitler's favor turned to poison. Wilhelm Keitel survived the war, but his survival was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. As chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces Skule, Keitel had been Hitler's most loyal military subordinate, a man so servile that other officers nicknamed him Lackitel, a play on the German word for lackey. He signed orders he knew were criminal, endorsed strategies he recognized as insane, and defended Hitler's decisions even when they led to catastrophe. When Germany surrendered, Keitel was among the first arrested. At Nuremberg, the prosecution painted him as more than a willing accomplice, as an active architect of Nazi military crimes. He had signed the Commissar Order, which mandated the execution of Soviet political officers. He had endorsed the Nacht und Nebel decree, which allowed for the disappearance of resistance fighters without trial. He had countersigned orders for reprisals against civilians, for the deportation of forced laborers, for the implementation of Hitler's scorched earth policies. Keitel's defense was pathetic in its simplicity. He was a soldier following orders. But the Nuremberg Tribunal established for the first time in international law that following orders was no defense for war crimes. On October 1st, 1946, he was found guilty on all 4 counts. His sentence, death by hanging. In his cell, Keitel wrote long, rambling letters attempting to justify his actions, to explain that he had been caught between military duty and moral responsibility. But his words rang hollow. He had choices at every step and had chosen loyalty to Hitler over everything else. On October 16, 1946, at 1:15 a.m., Wilhelm Keitel walked to the gallows in the Nuremberg prison gymnasium. His last words were a confused plea: "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I follow now my sons, all for Germany." The trapdoor opened, and Keitel dropped. The execution was badly done. He took 24 minutes to die, his body swinging and twitching as the noose slowly strangled him. Then there was Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall, a rank created specifically for him, placing him above all other field marshals and second only to Hitler himself. Once lean and dashing, the ace pilot of World War I, Göring had transformed into a grotesque parody of power, obese, drug-addicted, draped in medals and outlandish uniforms, presiding over the Luftwaffe's decline from dominant force to laughingstock. At Nuremberg, Göring proved himself the most formidable of the defendants. Despite months months of morphine withdrawal and forced sobriety, he demonstrated the intelligence and charisma that had once made him Hitler's chosen successor. He sparred with prosecutors, defended the Nazi regime, and refused to show remorse for anything except Germany's defeat. The tribunal found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to death by hanging. But Göring would not give the Allies the satisfaction of executing him through bribes or sympathetic guards. The truth was never fully established. He obtained a capsule of potassium cyanide on the night of October 15, 1946. Hours before his scheduled execution, Göring bit down on the capsule in his cell. His death was nearly instantaneous. His body discovered by guards who found him lying on his back, his face twisted in a final grimace of defiance. His suicide note was found tucked in his pocket. "I would have let you shoot me without further ado, but it is not possible to hang the German Reichsmarschall. I cannot permit this. For the sake of Germany, I cannot permit it." Even in death, Göring sought to control his narrative, to deny his enemies their victory, to preserve some fragment of the dignity he had long since forfeited through his crimes and corruption. These three men, Witzleben, Keitel, and Göring, died at Hitler's hand, or in Hitler's shadow. Their fates sealed the moment they bound themselves to his service. One was executed for betrayal, one for loyalty, and one escaped the noose through his own cunning. But all three shared the same end: disgrace, judgment, and deaths that echoed the brutality of the regime they had served with varying degrees of enthusiasm and horror. The black Mercedes rolled slowly through the autumn countryside, carrying Germany's most celebrated soldier toward his death. In the back seat sat Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, victor of France and legend of North Africa, now 52 years old, and facing an impossible choice presented to him an hour earlier by two generals sent from Berlin. The conversation had been brief and brutal. Rommel stood accused of foreknowledge of the July 20 plot against Hitler, though the evidence was circumstantial and likely fabricated. But in the paranoid final days of the Third Reich, suspicion was evidence enough. Hitler offered Rommel a choice: face a public trial that would destroy his reputation and threaten his family, or take poison and die a hero. The regime would announce he had succumbed to injuries from an earlier Allied strafing attack. His family would be protected, his honors preserved, his legend untarnished. Rommel said goodbye to his wife and son. He told them quietly what was about to happen, that he would be dead within 15 minutes. Then he climbed into the Mercedes with the two generals and their driver. They stopped on a quiet road outside town. One of the generals handed Rommel a small capsule. The Field Marshal, who had commanded the Afrika Korps, who had been called a military genius by Churchill himself, who had earned respect even from his enemies, bit down on the cyanide capsule. Death came quickly. Within 3 minutes, his body slumped in the back seat. The generals drove him to a military hospital in Ulm, where doctors pronounced him dead from his supposed injuries. Hitler ordered a state funeral. Rommel was eulogized as a hero who died serving the fatherland. The truth remained buried until after the war, when his wife and son finally revealed what had really happened that October afternoon. The Desert Fox had not died from enemy fire. He had been murdered by his own regime, offered suicide as the honorable alternative to public execution. 6 months later, as Allied armies closed on the Ruhr industrial region, another field marshal faced his final decision. Walter Model had been Hitler's firefighter, sent to crisis after crisis on the Eastern Front, expected to work miracles with depleted forces and impossible orders. He had stabilized the line after Operation Bagration, had slowed the Soviet advance, had earned Hitler's complete confidence through fanatical loyalty and tactical skill. Now, in April 1945, Model found himself trapped in the Ruhr pocket with 300,000 German soldiers surrounded by overwhelming American forces. Hitler's orders were clear: fight to the last man, no surrender. But Model knew the war was lost. He knew every soldier who died now died for nothing. Yet he could not bring himself to surrender. That would be disobedience, betrayal, the ultimate failure. On April 21, 1945, Model dissolved his army group, ordering his men to break out in small groups or surrender individually. Then he drove into the woods near Duisburg with his aide. They walked for a time in silence. Model had chosen his spot carefully, a quiet place in the forest where the sounds of war seemed distant. He spoke briefly to his aide about honor, about duty, about how a field marshal could not be seen being captured like a common criminal. Then he drew his pistol, placed it to his temple, and pulled the trigger. His body was buried quickly in an unmarked grave by his aide died and a few loyal soldiers. The exact location was forgotten in the chaos of Germany's collapse, and Model's remains were not found and properly identified until 1955. Model had been 54 years old, a soldier who had never known peace in his adult life, who had fought in both world wars and died rather than face defeat. His suicide note, found years later, was characteristically brief: "I did my duty by my conscience and my people." Between Rommel's forced suicide and Model's self-inflicted death came another tragedy. Günther von Kluge, who commanded Army Group B in Normandy during the Allied invasion. Kluge had been caught in an impossible situation, ordered by Hitler to launch counterattacks that were clearly suicidal, aware that the German position in France was collapsing, and suspected, probably recklessly, of having had contact with the officers plotting Hitler's assassination. After the failure of the German counterattack at Mortain in August 1944, Kluge was relieved of command and ordered back to Berlin. He knew what awaited him there: interrogation, accusation, probably execution. He had seen what happened to officers who fell under Hitler's suspicion. On August 19, 1944, during the drive back to Germany, Kluge asked his driver to stop near Metz. He stepped away from the vehicle, took out a cyanide capsule he had carried for months in case of capture, and swallowed it. He left behind a letter to Hitler, a strange document that mixed criticism with loyalty, that admitted Germany's situation was hopeless, but still praised the Führer's vision and determination. "When you receive these lines, I shall be no more," Kluge wrote. "I cannot bear the accusation that I sealed the fate of the West through faulty measures, and I have no means of defending myself. The German people have borne such untold suffering that it is time to bring the horror to a close." But even in his final letter, Kluge could not bring himself to fully condemn the man whose leadership had led Germany to ruin. The habit of obedience, the cult of loyalty, ran too deep. These three men, Rommel, Model, and Kluge, represent perhaps the most tragic category of Hitler's field marshals. They were not war criminals in the mold of some of their colleagues. They were soldiers, professionals who had operated largely within the traditional bounds of military conduct. But they had served a criminal regime, and when that service demanded their lives, they gave them, whether forced like Rommel or chosen like Model and Kluge. Their suicides were not acts of cowardice, but of despair, the final acknowledgement that they had bound themselves to a cause that was both lost and immoral, that there was no honorable way forward, no clean exit from the nightmare they had helped create. They chose death over surrender, over testimony, over having to face what they had been part of, and in their deaths, they robbed history of accountability, leaving questions unanswered and justice incomplete. The command bunker beneath the Univermag department store stank of unwashed bodies, gangrene, and defeat. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus sat at a makeshift desk, his face gaunt from months of inadequate rations, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. Outside, the final pockets of the German Sixth Army were being systematically destroyed by Soviet forces. Inside, Paulus faced the most consequential decision of his life. Hours earlier, he had received two messages. The first was from Hitler, a radio communication promoting him to Field Marshal, the youngest in German history. The message was transparent in its meaning. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler was giving Paulus one final order, unspoken but clear: commit suicide rather than be captured. The second message came from the Soviets, a surrender ultimatum promising humane treatment for prisoners. Around Paulus, his officers debated. Some urged collective suicide, death rather than the disgrace of capture. Others argued that further resistance was pointless murder, that every hour of continued fighting killed Germans for nothing. Paulus made his choice. On the morning of January 31st, 1943, he surrendered himself and the remnants of his army to Soviet forces. In doing so, he became the first German field marshal ever captured alive, shattering the myth of Prussian military honor that dictated death before dishonor. Hitler's rage was apocalyptic. He ranted for hours about Paulus's cowardice, about how the field marshal could have made himself immortal by dying heroically. Instead, Paulus had chosen survival, and in Hitler's mind, betrayal. But Paulus's captivity would prove more complex than simple survival. Initially, he refused to cooperate with Soviet propaganda efforts, maintaining his oath to Hitler and his identity as a German officer. He was held in reasonable conditions by Soviet standards, certainly better than the millions of German POWs dying in camps across the Usser. The transformation came slowly. Month after month in captivity, Paulus received news of Germany's continued collapse, of Hitler's increasingly insane orders, of cities reduced to rubble. He was shown evidence of Nazi atrocities, forced to confront the reality of the regime he had served, and gradually his loyalty crumbled. By 1944, Paulus began cooperating with the Soviet-sponsored National Committee for a Free Germany, a group of captured officers who called for resistance against Hitler. He made radio broadcasts urging surrender, wrote letters to other captured officers encouraging them to abandon their oaths. Some viewed this as pragmatic adaptation to captivity. Others saw it as betrayal, the final degradation of a man who had already surrendered his honor at Stalingrad. Most dramatically, Paulus testified at Nuremberg in 1946 as a prosecution witness, describing the criminal orders issued by the Wehrmacht High Command, confirming the military leadership's knowledge of atrocities. His appearance shocked Germany. The Field Marshal who had fought at Stalingrad, now wearing a Soviet uniform, speaking against his former comrades. Paulus remained in the Soviet Union until 1953, when he was finally released to East Germany. He settled in Dresden, living quietly on a Soviet pension, writing his memoirs, and defending his decision to surrender. He died on February 1st, 1957, 14 years to the day after his surrender at Stalingrad, from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. His legacy remains bitterly contested, pragmatist or traitor, survivor or collaborator. If Paulus represented controversial adaptation to captivity, Ferdinand Schörner embodied something darker, fanatical loyalty maintained even in defeat. Known as one of Hitler's most brutal commanders, Schörner had earned promotion to Field Marshal in the war's final weeks for his ruthless defense of Czechoslovakia. He executed his own soldiers for minor infractions, ran drumhead courts-martial that sent hundreds to firing squads, and implemented Hitler's scorched earth policies with zealous enthusiasm. When Germany surrendered, Schörner abandoned his troops and attempted to flee to Austria disguised as a mountain climber. He was captured by American forces on May 18, 1945, and immediately recognized. The Americans found him arrogant and unrepentant, still convinced of Nazi ideology's correctness, blaming Germany's defeat on betrayal rather than the regime's inherent evil. The Americans handed Schörner to the Soviets, who had particular interest in the man who had brutalized their territory and executed Soviet prisoners. He was tried in Moscow in 1952 and sentenced to 25 years in Soviet labor camps. The camps nearly killed him. He emerged in 1955 as a shadow of his former self, his health broken, his fanaticism finally extinguished by years of brutal captivity. But his ordeal was not over. Upon return to West Germany, Schörner was immediately arrested and tried by German courts for the wartime execution of German soldiers, for his drumhead courts-martial, and summary executions of deserters in the war's final days. He was convicted of manslaughter in 1957 and sentenced to 4.5 years, though he served less due to time already spent in Soviet custody. Schörner lived until 1973, dying at age 81 in Munich. Unlike Paulus, he never expressed remorse, never acknowledged the criminality of the regime he had served with such brutal efficiency. To the end, he remained convinced he had simply done his duty, that Germany's defeat was a historical tragedy rather than a moral judgment. These two men, Paulus and Schörner, represent the divergent paths of field marshals who survived to face their captors. One evolved, adapted, and perhaps found some measure of redemption through testimony against the regime he had served. The other remained frozen in his fanaticism, serving out his remaining years as a relic of a defeated ideology, unable or unwilling to comprehend the magnitude of what he had been part of. Their prolonged captivities, their trials and testimonies, their uncomfortable survival into a world that had judged and condemned the Reich they served, these became their punishment and their legacy, arguably more devastating to their reputations than death could ever have been. Gerd von Rundstedt died in his bed at age 77, surrounded by family, his death certificate listing natural causes. No trial had condemned him, no executioner had waited for him, no suicide note marked his end. Yet his final years had been anything but peaceful, haunted by interrogations, by the weight of knowledge, by the quiet judgment of a world that remembered what he had commanded and what he had permitted. Rundstedt represented the old Prussian officer class at its most refined and its most compromised. A career soldier from an aristocratic family, he had commanded with cool professionalism through both world wars. He had led Army Group South into Poland, had masterminded the breakthrough at Sedan that broke France, had commanded in the West during the Normandy invasion. Hitler had fired and rehired him multiple times, recognizing his competence while despising his old world military values. When captured by American forces in May 1945, Rundstedt was initially treated with deference, an old soldier at war's end, seemingly too traditional to have been complicit in Nazi crimes. But as investigators dug deeper, his record became more troubling. He had signed orders permitting reprisals against civilians. He had commanded Army Group South during Einsatzgruppen massacres massacres in Ukraine, and while he might not have directly ordered those atrocities, he had certainly known about them and had done nothing to stop them. The Allies prepared war crimes charges, but never brought Rundstedt to trial. His age and failing health became excuses. Cynics suggested that prosecuting the aristocratic, professional Rundstedt might undermine the narrative that Nazi crimes were the work of true believers rather than the traditional military establishment. So Rundstedt was released in 1949, his health broken, his reputation tarnished but not destroyed. He lived his final years in quiet obscurity in Hanover, refusing most interviews, writing brief, defensive memoirs that emphasized military operations while skating past moral questions. When he died, military bands played at his funeral and old officers saluted his coffin, but the honors felt hollow, the ceremony an echo of a world that no longer existed and probably never had. Albert Kesselring followed a similar trajectory, but with a harder edge. Commander of German forces in Italy, Kesselring had conducted a brilliant defensive campaign that tied down Allied armies for nearly 2 years. But his time in Italy was also marked by savage reprisals against partisans and civilians. The Ardeatine Caves massacre, 335 Italian civilians shot in retaliation for a partisan attack, had been carried out on his watch, under orders he had approved. Unlike Rundstedt, Kesselring did face trial. A British military court convicted him in 1947 of war crimes related to the execution of Italian prisoners and civilians. He was sentenced to death by firing squad, but the sentence was quickly commuted to life imprisonment and then reduced further. International pressure mounted for his release. Cold War politics made former Wehrmacht officers useful as potential allies against the Soviet Union. Kesselring was released in 1952, officially due to terminal cancer. The cancer proved far less terminal than claimed. He lived another 8 years, writing self-serving memoirs, speaking at veteran gatherings, insisting until his death in 1960 that he had done nothing wrong, that the reprisals had been militarily necessary, that he bore no responsibility for crimes committed by units under his command. His funeral drew hundreds of former soldiers, men who remembered his tactical brilliance but seemed able to forget or rationalize the bodies left in his wake. The contradiction was never resolved. Could a man be both a skilled commander and a war criminal? Kesselring's answer was always no. He saw himself as a soldier who had followed the laws of war as he understood them. History's answer was more complicated and more damning. Hugo Sperl escaped justice entirely through a combination of luck, politics, and bureaucratic exhaustion. A Luftwaffe Field Marshal who had commanded air forces during the Battle of Britain and in France, Sperl had presided over the bombing of cities, the destruction of cultural monuments, the terrorization of civilian populations. He was captured, held for 4 years during investigations, but never charged with any crime. The reasons for his escape remain murky. Some evidence suggested that Sperl had limited himself to military targets more than other Luftwaffe commanders. Other explanations were more cynical, that his crimes were hard to separate from Allied strategic bombing campaigns, that prosecuting Air Force commanders for bombing cities would invite uncomfortable comparisons, that by 1949, the Allies were more interested in moving past war crimes trials than in pursuing every possible defendant. Sperl was released in 1949 and died in Munich in 1953, having never faced formal judgment for his role in the destruction that rained from German bombers across Europe. His death barely made the newspapers. He had become a historical footnote, a name without significance, his lack of trial ensuring he would be remembered less than those who faced judgment. These 3 men, Rundstedt, Kesselring, and Sperl, achieved what many of their fellow field marshals did not. They died of natural causes, in their own beds, after the war. But their escapes from violent deaths did not mean they escaped judgment. They lived with the knowledge of what they had done, what they had permitted, what they had commanded. They faced the whispers, the accusations, the cold shoulders of a world that increasingly understood the full horror of Nazi crimes. Their memoirs were defensive, their public statements justifications. They could never quite escape the shadow of their service, never fully rejoin polite society without that shadow following. And while they avoided the noose, the firing squad, and the suicide's pistol, they lived long enough to see their world condemned, their causes defeated, their military achievements forever tainted by their association with one of history's most evil regimes. In the end, their natural deaths were not peaceful departures but prolonged reckonings. Years spent defending the indefensible, justifying the unjustifiable, and watching as history rendered its verdict against everything they had served. The man who died that that winter day in a quiet Bavarian town barely made the obituary columns. Wilhelm List had once commanded hundreds of thousands of men across the Balkans, had reported directly to Hitler, had worn the Field Marshal's baton with pride. Now he died at age 91, a name most Germans under 30 had never heard. His military achievements buried beneath the weight of his crimes, his rank and honors stripped of all meaning by what he had enabled. List's fall from grace had been comprehensive and perhaps inevitable. As commander of German forces in Greece and Yugoslavia, he had presided over some of the most brutal anti-partisan operations of the war. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of civilians executed in reprisal actions, villages burned, hostages shot at ratios of 100 to 1 for every German soldier killed by resistance fighters. The orders came from Hitler, from Keitel, from the Oak, but List had implemented them without apparent hesitation or moral qualm. He had authorized the shooting of civilians, the destruction of ancient towns, the collective punishment of entire regions. When subordinates questioned the severity of reprisals, List had not moderated, but intensified them, convinced that only overwhelming brutality could suppress partisan activity. At Nuremberg, List faced justice in the High Command trial, one of the subsequent proceedings after the main trial of top Nazi leaders. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Signed orders, witness testimony, the documented results of policies he had implemented. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. But like so many Wehrmacht officers, List did not serve his full sentence. The Cold War intervened. Former German officers were seen as valuable sources of information and potential allies against the Soviet Union. American attitudes toward German prisoners softened as geopolitical calculations trumped justice. List was released in 1952, his sentence commuted after less than 7 years served. His final 2 decades were lived in obscurity. No military pension honored his service. No veteran groups celebrated his achievements. He was a non-person, deliberately forgotten by a German society trying to distance itself from the Nazi past, while many of its members had been complicit in that past. When he died in 1971, the few obituaries that appeared focused on his early career, his tactical competence, carefully skirting the reason why he had spent years in an Allied prison. List's erasure was almost complete, not through execution or dramatic suicide, but through the slow suffocation of historical memory. He became a cautionary figure, studied only by historians of war crimes, a name in trial transcripts, a signature on orders better forgotten. Erhard Milch suffered a different kind of erasure, not forgotten, but deliberately minimized, his role in Nazi crimes downplayed through selective memory and Cold War pragmatism. Milch had been Göring's deputy in building the Luftwaffe, a brilliant organizer who had transformed German air power from a secret program violating the Versailles Treaty into the dominant air force in Europe by 1939. But Milch's achievements came at a terrible cost. He had overseen forced labor programs that worked tens of thousands to death in aircraft factories. He had attended conferences where the use of concentration camp inmates as slave labor was discussed and approved. He had knowledge of and involvement in medical experiments on prisoners. His hands were stained with far more than military defeats. They were stained with the blood of innocents worked to death, building the planes he commanded. At Nuremberg, Milch was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, particularly related to the use of slave labor. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence that acknowledged the severity of his crimes. But like List, Milch was released early. His sentence commuted in 1954 after only 9 years. His post-release life was comfortable by most standards. He worked as a consultant for German industry, wrote technical articles about aviation, lived well on the proceeds of his expertise. Unlike List, Milch was not completely forgotten. His technical achievements were too significant. His role in aviation history too important to erase entirely. But his later representations in history were carefully sanitized. Books about Luftwaffe development mentioned his organizational genius while skating past his war crimes. Aviation historians focused on his technical innovations while minimizing his use of slave labor. He became a figure whose crimes were acknowledged in footnotes, but whose competence was celebrated in main texts, a disturbing form of partial rehabilitation. Milch died in 1972 at age 79, his obituary split between those that emphasized his aviation achievements and those that remembered his crimes. The contradiction was never resolved, perhaps because it was irresolvable. A genuinely talented administrator who had placed that talent in service of murder, a man whose professional skills were inseparable from the atrocities that made those skills effective. These men, List, Milch, and others in their category, represented a particular kind of historical erasure. erasure. They were not executed dramatically like Witzleben, did not choose suicide like Rommel, did not face lengthy captivity like Paulus. Instead, they experienced something perhaps more unsettling. They lived long enough to watch themselves become irrelevant, to see their achievements stripped of glory, to witness their names become synonymous not with military competence, but with complicity in evil. Maximilian von Weichs followed a similar trajectory into historical obscurity, though his path was even more complete. As commander of Army Group B on the Eastern Front and later in the Balkans, Weichs had overseen operations of massive scale, the drive toward Stalingrad, anti-partisan operations in Yugoslavia. Yet somehow he slipped through the cracks of post-war justice. Weichs was never charged with war crimes, despite commanding forces during periods when atrocities were endemic. Part of his escape came from his reputation as a correct officer, one of the old school who supposedly maintained military propriety even under Hitler's regime. Part came from luck. The evidence gatherers focused on more prominent or more obviously criminal commanders. And part came from the simple exhaustion of the judicial process. By the late 1940s, the appetite for war crimes trials was waning, and lesser-known field marshals like Weichs could fade into the background. He was briefly detained after the war, questioned extensively, but released in 1948. He lived quietly in Bavaria until his death in 1954 at age 73. His obituaries were brief, noting his military service but avoiding detailed examination of what that service had entailed. He became a ghost in history, a field marshal who commanded armies across continents but left barely a trace in public memory. The pattern repeated with several other field marshals who survived the war but found their legacies systematically dismantled. Ewald von Kleist, who had commanded panzer armies in some of the war's most significant operations, was captured by the Americans and handed to the Soviets. Unlike Schörner, Kleist was not brutally treated. His captivity was harsh, but not exceptionally so. He was tried in the Soviet Union and sentenced to 25 years for war crimes related to operations in the Caucasus. Kleist died in Soviet captivity in 1954 at age 72 in a camp near Vladimir. His death was not announced for years. No body was returned to Germany. His family learned of his death through rumor and unofficial channels. He simply disappeared into the Soviet prison system and never emerged. Erased not through dramatic execution, but through bureaucratic indifference and the slow grinding of the Gulag system. These erasures, judicial, historical, and physical, represented a different kind of reckoning than the dramatic ends suffered by other field marshals. There were no state funerals, no final defiant gestures, no moments of historical significance, just the slow fade of men who had once commanded millions, reduced to footnotes, their names appearing only in specialized historical studies, their achievements and crimes both buried beneath the weight of a past their society wanted to forget. The deliberate forgetting served multiple purposes. It allowed West Germany to construct a narrative of the clean Wehrmacht, the myth that regular military forces had fought honorably while atrocities were committed only by the SS and party fanatics. Field marshals like List, Weichs, and others who had clearly participated in or enabled war crimes complicated that narrative, so they were minimized, their stories truncated, their crimes acknowledged in trial transcripts but not in public memory. By the 1960s and 1970s, as these men died of old age in comfortable obscurity, Germany had largely succeeded in separating the Wehrmacht's reputation from Nazi crimes. The field marshals who had survived became embarrassing reminders of a more complicated truth, that the military elite had been fully complicit, that following orders had meant implementing genocide, that tactical brilliance had been placed in service of evil. Their deaths in old age, in their own beds, surrounded by family, seemed almost merciful compared to the fates of Witzleben or Rommel. But in another sense, they suffered a harsher judgment. They lived long enough to become irrelevant, to watch their life's work condemned, to see their professional achievements forever tainted. They experienced not the sharp pain of execution, but the dull ache of obsolescence. Not the drama of suicide, but the indignity of being deliberately forgotten by a society that wanted to move past the crimes they represented. The city burned. Soviet artillery pounded the ruins of what had been the Reich Chancellery, reducing Hitler's seat of power to rubble and ash. In bunkers and basements across Berlin, the last defenders of the Third Reich fought with the desperate energy of men who knew they were already dead. Above them, the red banner of the Soviet Union was raised over the Reichstag, announcing to the world what everyone already knew: knew Nazi Germany was finished. In command posts scattered across what remained of German-held territory, the surviving field marshals faced the end of their world. Some, like Model, had already chosen death. Others, like Schörner, still clung to the delusion that somehow, impossibly, the situation could be salvaged. A few, like Kesselring, prepared for surrender and whatever judgment would follow. 24 men had held the rank of Field Marshal in Hitler's Reich. By war's end, their fates painted a comprehensive portrait of how absolute power corrupts, and how that corruption inevitably leads to ruin. 3 had been executed or forced to suicide by Hitler himself, Witzel been hanged for conspiracy, Rommel poisoned for suspected disloyalty, Keitel and Gring condemned at Nuremberg. Their deaths illustrated the fundamental truth of totalitarian regimes. Loyalty is never enough, competence is never sufficient, and the dictator's favor is always temporary and conditional. 4 had chosen suicide over surrender or capture. Model, Kluge, and others who could not face the humiliation of defeat or the judgment that would follow. Their deaths were acts of both despair and arrogance. Despair at the collapse of everything they had fought for. Arrogance in believing they could control their narratives by controlling their deaths. But history judged them anyway, and their suicides changed nothing except denying justice the satisfaction of formal trials. 2 had been captured and imprisoned for decades. Paulus, who broke under the weight of Stalingrad and eventually testified against his former comrades, and Schörner, who remained fanatically loyal even through years in Soviet labor camps. Their prolonged captivities became their punishments, forcing them to live with their choices, to watch from prison as the world condemned everything they had fought to preserve. Several had died natural deaths after the war. Rundstedt, Kesselring, Sperl, and others who escaped violent ends but not historical judgment. They lived long enough to write defensive memoirs, to attend awkward veteran gatherings, to face the uncomfortable questions of their grandchildren about what they had done and why. Their comfortable deaths could not erase their uncomfortable legacies, and many had simply been erased. List, Milch, Weitz, and others who faded into obscurity, their names becoming footnotes in historical studies, their achievements buried beneath their crimes, their ranks and honor stripped of meaning by association with genocide and aggressive war. The pattern across all these deaths reveals something profound about power, loyalty, and moral responsibility. These men had not been monsters in the cartoonish sense. They had been professionals, many of them quite talented, who had placed their considerable skills in service of a monstrous regime. They had convinced themselves that they were soldiers, not politicians, that they could serve Germany without serving Hitler's ideology, that military honor could be maintained even while implementing criminal orders. This delusion proved fatal for most of them. The rank of Field Marshal, which they had accepted with pride, became a mark of shame. The victories they had won were revealed as steps toward catastrophe. The armies they had commanded were judged not by their tactical accomplishments, but by their complicity in atrocity. Consider the arithmetic of their fates. Of the 24 field marshals Hitler created, only a handful died natural deaths in freedom after serving their sentences. The rest were executed, committed suicide, died in captivity, or lived as disgraced shadows of their former selves. This was not bad luck or coincidence. It was the inevitable outcome of serving a regime built on lies, conquest, and mass murder. The field marshals who thought rank would protect them learned otherwise. Witzleben discovered that decades of military service meant nothing when Hitler suspected disloyalty. Keitel learned that absolute obedience could not save him from the hangman's noose. Gring found that all his power and cunning could only buy him the choice of how to die, not whether to live. The field marshals who thought suicide was an honorable escape learned otherwise. Rommel's forced suicide could not preserve his reputation once the truth emerged. Model's death in the woods did not spare him historical judgment. Kluge's cyanide capsule could not erase his complicity in years of criminal warfare. The field marshals who thought captivity would lead to eventual rehabilitation learned otherwise. Paulus lived 3 decades after Stalingrad, but those years did not redeem him. They merely prolonged his reckoning. Schörner survived Soviet camps only to face German courts. His fanaticism finally recognized as criminal rather than commendable. The field marshals who thought they could fade into comfortable obscurity learned otherwise. Rundstedt died in his bed, but lived his final years under investigation and suspicion. Kesselring was released from prison only to spend his remaining years defending the indefensible. List and others were deliberately forgotten, their names erased from the honor rolls they had once graced. The cruelest irony was that the rank itself, the field marshal's baton they had all coveted, coveted, became worthless in the end. In traditional military hierarchies, such rank conferred honor, respect, and historical remembrance. But Hitler's field marshals discovered that honors bestowed by a criminal regime become marks of shame. Their batons, their medals, their impressive titles, all became evidence of complicity rather than symbols of achievement. Some tried to argue they were just following orders, but Nuremberg established definitively that obedience to criminal orders is no defense. Others claimed they had been military professionals uninvolved in politics, but their signatures on criminal orders and their command during atrocities demolished that fiction. A few maintained they had fought honorably within the rules of war, but the massacred civilians, the implemented scorched earth policies, and the authorized reprisals proved otherwise. The historical judgment has been unambiguous. Hitler's field marshals were not tragic heroes caught in impossible circumstances. They were willing participants in a criminal enterprise, men who placed their professional skills and tactical brilliance in service of genocide and aggressive war. Some were more culpable than others. Schörner's brutality was different from Rommel's relative restraint, but all shared the fundamental crime of fighting to preserve and expand a regime dedicated to mass murder and racial supremacy. Their deaths, whether violent or peaceful, dramatic or quiet, could not change this judgment. Witzlebend's execution did not make him a martyr. Rommel's forced suicide did not preserve his honor. Paulus's testimony did not fully redeem him. Rundstedt's natural death did not grant him peace. The historical verdict remained constant regardless of how they died. They had served evil, and no amount of tactical brilliance could offset that moral failure. In the end, every field marshal fell the same way the Reich itself fell, defeated, discredited, and condemned by history. Some fell quickly, by rope or poison or bullet. Others fell slowly, through years of imprisonment or decades of disgrace. But all of them fell, because the edifice they had built their careers upon was rotten at its foundation. The 24 batons Hitler distributed were not symbols of honor but chains binding their recipients to a doomed cause. The men who accepted them thought they were joining an elite brotherhood. Instead, they were signing their own death warrants. Whether those deaths came quickly or slowly, violently or peacefully, the outcome was the same. They commanded continents, moved armies like chess pieces, made decisions that affected millions of lives. They believed their rank and power made them special, elevated them above ordinary morality, insulated them from judgment. But in the end, they learned what every tyrant's servant eventually learns. Power without moral foundation is just temporary control over doomed enterprises, and rank bestowed by monsters becomes a stigma rather than an honor. The Third Reich promised them glory, conquest, victory, a 1,000-year empire. It delivered ruin, execution, suicide, imprisonment, and disgrace. Their deaths were not tragic in the classical sense, because tragedy requires the fall of essentially good people through fatal flaws. These were capable men who chose to serve evil, and their ends reflected that choice. Some died defiant, still convinced of their righteousness. Others died broken, finally understanding what they had been part of. A few died quietly, trying to outlive judgment and failing. But all of them died as the regime they served deserved to die, condemned, defeated, and relegated to history as warnings rather than examples. 24 field marshals, 24 batons, 24 different paths to the same destination. Power without conscience ends in ruin. Loyalty to evil ends in judgment. And military brilliance in service of genocide ends not in glory but in the ash heap of history, where these men and their regime rightly belong. Their deaths tell us nothing about honor or sacrifice or military virtue, but they tell us everything about the price of serving tyranny, the inevitability of moral reckoning, and the truth that in the end, justice may be delayed and imperfect, but it comes for everyone, even field marshals.